It's Friday, the 13th of January, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. On the programme this week, as strikes continue nationwide, the government introduces plans to require the public sector to provide a minimum level of service.
We do not want to use this legislation, but we must ensure the safety of the British public.
The Prime Minister clashes with the Labour leader over the NHS at PMQs.
His response to the greatest crisis in the history of the NHS is to threaten to sack our nurses.
No one denies the union's freedom to strike, but it is also important to balance that with people's right to have access to life-saving healthcare.
Labour accuses the government of betraying the Windrush generation once again.
I don't know what the West Indian community has done to this government to be treated so cruelly, so harshly and so heartlessly.
And in Wales, the NHS also dominates First Minister's questions.
You brought forward a proposal and instructed the NHS to discharge patients without care plans and suitable provision within the community when they're discharged.
I completely reject the characterisation that the Leader of the Opposition has made, and he should know better.
Let's start with events here in Westminster with Sean Curran. Sean, hello to you. It may be a new parliamentary term, but the year has begun as it finished at the end of last year with strikes across the public sector. And there have been ongoing concerns over winter pressures in the health service in England. The week began with a statement by the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay. What did he have to say?
Yes, this was the first order of business on the very first day back. So Steve Barclay came to the Commons to make a statement about a plan that had been trailed a couple of days in advance, which will see the government buy up care beds in England. And the idea is to address this problem, which sees thousands of people in NHS beds in England every day where they don't need to be there because they're medically fit. So they could be discharged from hospital if there was somewhere for them to go. And so what the government is going to do over the next few weeks, it's going to spend millions of pounds block booking beds so that people can be discharged from hospital. And the idea is that this will create kind of a domino effect, that those beds will be released and that will release some of the pressure in A&E, and that in turn will reduce some of the problems that we've seen with ambulance waiting times. But Steve Barclay also began, I think, with a different sort of tone from the one we heard before Christmas, where he was a bit more emollient, and also he began by expressing regret for the service and experience that some people have had.
I and the government regret the experience for some patients and staff in emergency care has not been acceptable in recent weeks. Flu has made this winter particularly tough. First, because we're facing the worst flu season for 10 years. The number of people in hospital with flu this time last year was 50. This year, it was over 5,100. The scale, the speed, the timing of our flu season has combined with the ongoing high level of COVID admissions in hospital and the pandemic legacy of high delayed discharge to put real strain on frontline services.
I noticed the Secretary of State didn't take a moment to talk about the abysmal failure of his talks with nurses and paramedic representatives today. So let me say to him, every cancelled operation, delayed appointments and ambulance disruption due to strikes could have been avoided if he had just agreed to talk to NHS staff about pay. Today he could have opened serious talks to avert further strikes. Instead, he offered nurses and paramedics 45 minutes of lip service. If patients suffer further strike action, they will know exactly who to blame. And this government has the audacity to ask NHS staff for minimum service levels. When are we going to see minimum service levels from government ministers in the entire government?
Retention is at the heart of this crisis, both in the health sector and in the social care sector. And you can't retain staff if you don't pay them. And if you don't pay them in this year, they won't address the issues. Will you recognise when he set the remit for the pay review body, inflation wasn't where it was, we didn't have a war in Ukraine, but factors have changed, and therefore the remit must change for pay within this year so that we retain the staff to deliver what he's proposing.
Around a quarter of delayed discharge is due to delays in what's known as Pathway 1, the domiciliary care side. That is what the 500 million in particular recognise, so we are putting more money into that, but that's about the social care sector so we can get flow through delayed discharge.
They also have COVID and flu in France or Germany or Italy or Sweden or Holland, and winter after winter they cope far better because they have much more integrated social insurance systems. Now, some people like me have been banging on this for years, but now the former Health Secretary, the member for Bromsgrove, is suggesting a social insurance system. Newspaper editorial after newspaper editorial. What is our long-term plan? We can't leave the Labour Party to have a long-term plan, and we don't. How are we going to reform this centrally controlled construct so the people of my age pay taxes all their life and their only right is to join the back of a 2-year queue? What is his plan?
In France, in Germany, in Canada, in many other countries, this massive spike in flu and COVID pressure, combined with the pressures from the pandemic, has placed similar strains on other healthcare systems. So it is simply not the case to say that this is an issue that affects England and England alone.
We know that resilience was stripped out of our NHS years before the COVID pandemic. And I come back to the level of vacancies, 133,000 in our NHS, 165,000 in social care. So will the Minister admit that as well as growing the workforce, we urgently need to keep the workforce that we have? And if so, why isn't the government at least meeting the nurses halfway on pay, as the RCN have offered? And why, after 13 years of Tory government, is the average care worker pay less than pay at McDonald's or at Amazon?
To her point on social care, part of the purpose of the 500 million that the Chancellor announced in the autumn statement was to recognise the pressure on workforce. That is why that funding was prioritised. That is also why Home Office colleagues have put social care workers on the shortage occupation list to better enable us to also attract international talent.
Sean, we heard there about minimum service levels for most of the public sector in England, Wales and Scotland during industrial action. This has been one of the responses from the government. They've been talking about it, of course, haven't they, for a while. Now, on Tuesday, a new bill was actually introduced to ensure these minimum levels. What does it actually mean?
Right, OK. So the Conservatives at the last election, 2019, promised that they would introduce minimum service levels for public transport. And this is the idea that if people are going to go on strike, before the strike takes place, the employers would say, well, we're going to need some people to work to keep a basic service running. Now the government has come back and said they want to expand that idea so that it will cover what they consider to be the key areas of the public sector and a bit beyond. Now, we'll hear in the exchanges that follow opposition MPs calling these proposals the Sack Nurses Bill. And that's because if you have a strike in the NHS, say, and the NHS come along and say, well, we need these people to work, and you're told you've got to go into work, and you then decide to go on strike, then you would lose your automatic protection from unfair dismissal. So it's very controversial. The unions say that they think it's unworkable. They've suggested that it's illegal. The government say we're not trying to take away the right to strike and we're not going to ban people from striking. And they insist we're not trying to sack anybody, but we want to have these minimum service level agreements. And they say that in some respects, Britain is out of step with other European countries where this legislation already exists. So what happened this week was a very formal procedure where the title of the bill, Strikes Minimum Service Levels Bill, is read out. But unusually, we got a statement from the Business Secretary, Grant Shapps, which meant that there was this initial debate, a first chance, if you like, for MPs to talk about what the government was proposing and, of course, for the Minister to set out his case.
A lack of timely cooperation from the ambulance unions meant employers could not reach agreement nationally for minimum safety levels during recent strikes, and health officials were left guessing at the likely minimum coverage, making contingency planning almost impossible and putting everyone's constituents' lives at risk. The ambulance strike plan for tomorrow still do not have minimum safety levels in place. And this will result in patchy emergency care for the British people, and this cannot continue. So I'm introducing a bill that will give government the power to ensure that vital public services will have to maintain a basic function by delivering minimum safety levels, ensuring that lives and livelihoods are not lost. Mr. Speaker, we're looking at 6 key areas, each of them critical for keeping the British people safe and society functioning. These are health, education, fire, rescue, transport, border security and nuclear decommissioning. We do not want to use this legislation, but we must ensure the safety of the British public.
I want to start by tackling the Secretary of State's comments. It's the first thing that comes to my mind in this debate, and what the Secretary of State said is my constituent Bina, who waited over an hour for an ambulance, who died waiting for an ambulance, and that was not on a strike day. That is because of the disastrous chaos we have in the system under this Conservative government. There's no common sense about this at all. He says he recognises pressures faced by key workers, but he knows the NHS cannot find the nurses that they need to work on the ward. He knows the trains don't run even on non-strike days, such as their shortage of staff. So how can he seriously think that sacking thousands of key workers won't just plunge our public services further into crisis?
When he says the British people need to know that when they have a heart attack, a stroke or a serious injury, that an ambulance will turn up, and that if they need hospital care, they have access to it, would he not agree with me that a better way of ensuring that is to deal with the actual problem, to invest, to recruit and retain staff in the NHS and the ambulance service, and provide the service that's being cried out for, not just by us, but by those people themselves, rather than tinker about with what you'll do when you can't solve it? Fix the problem. Might be a better way.
It is undeniable that not having a minimum safety level in place during strike days puts lives at risk, and this government will take the responsible decision to prevent that from happening in the future.
Well, the issues discussed there with Grant Shapps, the Business Secretary, also dominated Prime Minister's question, Sean, the first one of the year, of course, with Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer.
Yes, they really formed the core of their exchanges, but we also got another health-related issue. At the weekend, Rishi Sunak repeatedly refused to say whether or not he was registered with a private GP. And right at the very start of Prime Minister's question, the very first question, he took advantage of the question to set out his stall.
There are no NHS dentists taking on patients in Lancaster and Fleetwood, and for those constituents of mine lucky enough to have one, they're waiting months for an appointment. So can I ask the Prime Minister how long he had to wait for his last NHS dentist appointment?
I am registered with an NHS GP. I have used independent healthcare in the past. I'll answer her question. I am registered with NHS GP. I have used independent healthcare in the past, and I'm also grateful to the Friarage Hospital for the fantastic care they've given my family over the years.
In the 13 years of the last Labour government, there were no national NHS strikes. If the Prime Minister had negotiated with the nurses before Christmas, they wouldn't be on strike. If he'd negotiated with the ambulance workers, they wouldn't be on strike either. So why is he choosing to prolong the misery rather than end these strikes?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we've always been clear that we want to have constructive dialogue with the unions. That is also why, when it comes to the issue of pay, we have accepted in full the independent recommendations of the pay review bodies. But now the honourable gentleman simply doesn't have a policy when it comes to this question. If he talks about wanting to end the strikes. The question for him is simple then. Why does he not support our minimum safety legislation?
Mr. Speaker, when I clap nurses, I meant it. His response to the greatest crisis in the history of the NHS is to threaten to sack our nurses. His Transport Secretary says it's not the solution. His Education Secretary hopes it won't apply in schools. His own assessments say it could increase the number of strikes. The simple truth is you can't legislate your way out of 13 years of failure. Between 2010 and 2019, before anyone had heard of COVID, Prime Minister, the number of people stuck on the NHS waiting list doubled. Why do patients always wait longer under the Tories?
Talks about the minimum safety legislation. Let's just talk about it a little bit further, because this is a simple proposition that no one denies the union's freedom to strike, but it is also important to balance that with people's right to have access to life-saving healthcare at the same time. Mr. Speaker, this shouldn't be controversial. This shouldn't be controversial. The International Labour Organization supports minimum service levels. They're present in France, in Italy, in Spain. Normally, he's in favour of more European alignment, Mr. Speaker. Why not now?
This is not just about routine care. There could be nothing more terrifying than being told you might have cancer. That's why the last Labour government brought in a guarantee you'd been seen by a specialist within 2 weeks. Today, 50,000 people are waiting longer than that. 50,000. And everyone in this House will appreciate the anxiety that they're feeling. So when will cancer patients once again get the certainty of quick care that they got under Labour?
Mr. Speaker, why is there a challenge with cancer times right now? I tell you, again, it's just absolutely no understanding of the situation, Mr. Speaker. What happened to cancer referrals during COVID? They went down by almost 2/3, Mr. Speaker. That was because of a pandemic. In Australia and Canada and the US, they banned strikes on blue light services. We're not doing that. All we're saying is that in these emergency services, patients should be able to rely on a basic level of life-saving care. Why is he against that, Mr. Speaker?
Let's reflect upon numbers, and in particular, those numbers which were shone a light on by Sam Coates of Sky, in particular those in relation to the Prime Minister's favourite potential successor, which showed that over the course of 4 months, from 4 speeches, he raked in excess of £1 million. Does the Prime Minister not find it utterly perverse that senior members of the Conservative Party are feathering their nest in this way, whilst at the same time seeking to deny working people the opportunity to strike for fair pay?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't think we need to talk about our predecessors, but I remember. I think it was one of his predecessors that did indeed work for Russia Today, if I'm not mistaken. But what I would say is he talks about the priorities. You know, yesterday the SNP spent time talking yet more about independence at a time when we should be talking about delivering for people across the United Kingdom, focusing on their jobs, improving the NHS across the UK, in Scotland as in everywhere else. That's the kind of thing I want to talk to the Scottish Government about, and I hope that he'll work with me to do that.
Fire exchanges, I should say, at PMQs. But what's next on the minimum service legislation?
So on Monday, MPs will hold their first big debate on the general ideas behind the bill. That's what's known in the jargon as the second reading, and that will be the first opportunity for MPs to vote on the bill on Monday night.
Thank you, Sean. More from you later. Let's find out what's been happening in the Scottish Parliament now. Our reporter Jenny Davidson is at Holyrood. Hello to you, Jenny. As at Westminster, unsurprisingly, one of the biggest topics for discussion has been pressures on the NHS. What are the key issues?
Well, much the same things that you've been talking about in relation to England, actually. One of the key ones being A&E waiting times, with the latest figures showing that only 56% of people were seen within the 4-hour target, and record numbers now waiting 12 hours or more to be seen. And Dr. Leila Nathoo, who's the Deputy Chair of the BMA in Scotland, she suggested that hospitals in Scotland are not safe. Patients are being put at risk. Now, on Monday, the First Minister held a briefing on health on the NHS, kind of in the style of the COVID updates that she had during the pandemic. She talked through some of the issues. She talked about extraordinary levels of flu, in addition to things like COVID obviously still having an impact, and strep A. And she said that hospitals in Scotland were nearly full. They're at 95% capacity. And again, this issue of delayed discharge coming up here, with 1,700 people in Scottish hospitals who are medically fit to leave but can't leave because they don't have a care package in place. Now, on Tuesday, Health Secretary Hamza Yousaf also made a statement to Parliament on health, and he announced some more money to free up some more places in care homes to try and get those people out of hospital. But opposition parties have suggested the Scottish Government just hasn't been well enough prepared for this winter.
Under the Cabinet Secretary's watch, the Scottish NHS is on its knees. A&E waiting times, cancer waiting times and delayed discharge are all at their worst ever level, with no improvement in sight. And whilst record number of patients were waiting over 12 hours in A&E, where was the Health Secretary? We heard nothing from Hamza Yousaf over the festive period. This is a national emergency. People are dying unnecessarily. Our heroic NHS staff are overwhelmed and are burning out. The crisis in our NHS should be a priority for this Parliament, because it is a priority for the people of Scotland, and they will be appalled today. I simply cannot fathom why the Cabinet Secretary did not plan for, in his words, the worst ever winter our NHS faces.
Dr. Sandesh Gohani asked me, where was I? Well, I was busy in the festive period talking to our trade union colleagues. If his party, of course, did the same, they may not have nurses and ambulance drivers walking out on strike. In terms of his questions around planning, I noticed that the Conservatives published a winter plan. They published it in mid-December. That is not particularly helpful nor useful, because the winter planning that we undertook, of course, took place after the last winter had passed. So what I would say to Conservative members when it comes to planning, of course, if Dr. Sandesh Gohani was the oracle he claims to be and could have predicted every single one of the pressures the NHS is facing, he might have wanted to tell his colleagues down south.
And when it comes to this planning, there's arguments too about staffing levels. The Scottish Government saying that staffing within the NHS is at record levels now, while opposition parties have been pointing to high levels of vacancies, particularly in areas such as nursing.
Jenny, the NHS came up again at First Minister's questions. What was discussed there?
It did. Questions asked about health from Conservatives, Labour and the Lib Dems at First Minister's questions this week. Again, one of the key issues about A&E waiting times and the potential of loss to life when people are not seen quickly enough there. Now, the Conservatives were pointing out in particular that fewer people are turning up at A&E than before the pandemic. Nicola Sturgeon saying, well, actually, that's a good thing. People are being diverted away from A&E. And she said the issue wasn't so much the numbers of people turning up as the hospitals being so full that it was slowing down people moving through the system.
This dire situation confirms yet again this Health Secretary and this government is not on top of this crisis. His failures are creating risk to lives across the country. First Minister, surely for the good of Scotland, it's time to sack Hamza Yousaf.
With the Health Secretary, we'll continue to take the actions that are necessary to support our NHS during these very difficult times. I said earlier on, and I don't take anything for granted, and I am not intending to sound complacent at all about this, but it's because we respect so highly those who work in the front line of our National Health Service that we are offering them right now a much higher pay increase for next year than any other government anywhere else in the UK, and thus far we have avoided industrial action in our National Health Service.
And the key message there perhaps is thus far, because actually 3 medical unions in Scotland, 3 health unions, have voted in principle in favour of strike action, including the Royal College of Nursing. And it's not certain yet whether some kind of pay deal can be reached that can avoid that.
Indeed, Jenny. On a different subject, the Scottish Government's also published a new energy strategy this week. Tell us about it.
That's right, a new draft energy strategy, and that's, again, particularly trying to show how the Scottish Government can reach its target of net zero carbon by 2045. Targets in particular about renewable energy generation, about hydrogen generation, and a clear message that they're wanting to move away from oil and gas as quickly as possible. And the strategy is saying the Scottish Government won't support new oil and gas exploration, although that's actually a decision for the UK government whether that goes ahead or not. But Labour's criticised this strategy for being a rehash of existing policies. The Conservatives warned of potential of loss of oil and gas jobs in the northeast of Scotland. Now, the Scottish Government has said it aims to have a transition from oil and gas jobs to green jobs to avoid job losses. But Labour questioned whether those green jobs will actually materialise.
In 2010, the SNP promised there would be 130,000 renewable jobs per year by 2020. We'd be the Saudi Arabia of renewables, they said. Well, the reality behind the rhetoric is just a fifth of those jobs have been delivered, and supply chain contract after supply chain contract continue to go overseas. So few people will believe the Cabinet Secretary's commitments today. But, Presiding Officer, it's not just the jobs this government is offshoring. 90% of the energy from the recent ScotWind leasing round will come through overseas-owned multinationals offshoring the billions in profits. So at a time Labour in Wales are committed to creating a Welsh publicly owned energy firm, and the next UK Labour government are committed to a UK publicly owned energy firm, why is there no commitment from the Scottish Government in this strategy to a publicly owned energy firm to keep bills down and to keep the profits here in Scotland?
Scotland is actually the highest part of the UK, where we're seeing the fastest level of growth in green jobs. We want to build on that, and we want to capitalise on that moving forward. And let me deal with the final point in terms of the public energy company. The member will be aware that we looked at the possibility of setting up a public energy company in the retail sector, and the present markets simply do not allow that to happen. But I'm sure the member will recognise that for many decades, while the Labour Party were in government at Westminster, they failed to put in place any form of fund that helped to secure some of the revenues from North Sea over decades to make sure that it was invested for future use. They've taken the exact same approach that the Westminster Tory government has taken, and that is they have quite literally siphoned off the taxes from our oil and gas sector over decades, and we have got no benefit to show for that.
And this comes after the UK's Climate Change Committee's warned that the Scottish Government's climate goals are at risk because it's not meeting its interim targets. So there's going to be a lot of focus on whether the strategy can actually deliver.
Thank you, Jenny. Jenny Davidson reporting there from Holyrood. Let's return to Westminster now and talk to Sean about another dominant issue, of course, which has been the cost of living. And this week we heard that the government support for energy bills for business is to be reduced quite dramatically. We knew it was in the pipeline, to coin a phrase, but what was said?
Yes, so last year the government set up a scheme to help not just businesses but charities and schools and hospitals as well. And the idea was that they would have their energy costs capped. Now that's turned out to be extremely expensive. And now the government is saying that basically it is too expensive for it to continue. And so this week we saw an announcement about a new scheme that will come into force later on in the year in April. And this time, instead of capping the costs, businesses, charities, hospitals, schools, they'll be offered a discount on the wholesale price of energy. So this is hugely controversial. A lot of business organisations, particularly those representing small businesses, don't like it. And of course, there was criticism when the scheme was announced in the Commons.
Today I can confirm a new energy bills discount scheme for businesses, charities and the public sector. Up to £5.5 billion will be made available from the end of the energy bill relief scheme period on the 31st of March until the 31st of March 2024. The Chancellor has been working with the key industry stakeholders to get this right. We heard that they needed a 12-month rather than a 6-month scheme. We have listened, and as a result, I confirm that we will be providing a year's worth of support for all non-domestic bills beyond the current 6-month scheme. This means a typical pub can expect a taxpayer-funded discount of up to £2,300 over 12 months, and a typical small retail store will get up to £400 off their annual energy bill.
It is criminal that the stick-and-plaster politics has forced British businesses into the same cycle. Firms unable to plan, not knowing what the next month will bring, let alone the next quarter. Business owners and their staff have faced 2 Christmases racked with worry because of COVID and half-baked announcements from this government. Of course, the government is not responsible for the effects of the war in Ukraine. But the truth is, it wasn't the war that banned the onshore wind or scrapped the home insulation and shut our gas storage facility. The Tory government did that.
Can I give my honourable friend a real-world example of what's happening in the non-domestic sector? A very popular local pub in the Kettering constituency emailed me this week. Up until January the 2nd, they were paying £2,000 a month for electricity. Then their supplier, at the end of the contract, switched them to an out-of-contract tariff of £9,700 a month. They went out to the market and reluctantly, with another supplier, had to agree to a cost of £5,700 a month.
At the end of October, I had a meeting with a number of publicans in my constituency. They were looking forward to strong demand during the World Cup and over Christmas, but they were deeply, deeply concerned about what would happen, particularly between January and March, and they were desperate for clarity over what would happen in support for fuel bills.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. All I can say is I suspect pubs did get a boost from the World Cup, and I wish that had run for longer, but I'm afraid that's something beyond my control.
Let's be clear, this decision does pose an existential threat to small businesses, many of whom think that in a sense they're being left vulnerable to wholesale energy price hikes while the government washes its hands and walks away. Will he look at it again, and in particular, can he also look at other ways of supporting small businesses with the multiple challenges they face?
I would say to the Honourable Lady that this remains generous support. It is not as generous. I've been absolutely clear as that, but it will still be significant for businesses. All of us, whether people who run charities, run businesses, or ministers, have to look at what more we can all do to run our operations more efficiently in the face of these huge changes in energy prices.
Big announcement, of course. Thank you very much, Sean. More from you later in the programme. Let's go to Cardiff now, and our Wales political reporter is there. Hello to Kemlyn Davis. Kemlyn, we've been discussing on the show with both Sean and Jenny about the challenging few weeks for the NHS across the UK, and unsurprisingly, it is a similar situation in Wales, which dominated FMQs this week.
Yes, absolutely. The Welsh NHS has been struggling to cope in recent weeks, with hospitals facing unprecedented demand and nurses describing working conditions as hell on earth. Now, a large part of the problem has been the unavailability of hospital beds, which is why last week senior NHS leaders, backed by the Welsh Government, wrote to hospitals telling them that they could release medically fit patients even if their full care arrangements in the community aren't yet in place. Now, the government insists people would only be discharged if it's safe for them to go home or to go to a care home. But the move has been criticised by many doctors and those working in the social care sector. They say that ultimately this will lead to people simply being readmitted to hospital. And this matter was raised during FMQs on Tuesday by the leader of the Welsh Conservatives group here, Andrew R.T. Davis.
You brought forward a proposal and instructed the NHS to discharge patients without care plans and suitable provision within the community when they're discharged. Doctors and health professionals have said that patients could potentially die or come to serious harm. Do you agree with the doctors and health professionals in their assessment on your plans?
Well, Llywydd, I completely reject the characterisation that the Leader of the Opposition has made, and he should know better. It is utterly irresponsible of him to misrepresent the advice, not of the Welsh Government, but of the Deputy Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Nursing Officer of Wales. I have their letter in front of me, and it does not in any way bear out the accusations that the Leader of the Opposition has just made. It refers throughout to safe discharge. But what it does is to say to the system that the system has to attend to the balance of risk across all of those people for whom it seeks to provide care. We have people, as he well knows, and often puts to me on the floor of the Senedd, who are struggling to get access to the front door of this system, often people with very significant needs. At the other end of the system, prior to Christmas, we had 1,200 patients in a health service bed in Wales who were medically fit to be discharged.
Mark Drakeford there. And after First Minister's questions, the Health Minister gave a statement. What did she say, Cemlyn?
Yes, Leila Morgan gave a very detailed picture of the pressures on the entire health and social care system at the moment as a result of flu and COVID rates, staff sickness, industrial action and so on. And she explained, for example, that on the 27th of December, the Welsh NHS saw its busiest ever day with 550 people admitted to hospital on that single day alone. Well, after her statement, Leila Morgan faced questions from other party members and she faced suggestions that the government had failed to adequately prepare for this winter.
Minister, you claim that planning for winter pressures started in April, but I am concerned, as I relayed at the time, that the publication of the plan to tackle these pressures was late in coming forward. And it is clear that the process, I would suggest, isn't working.
You talk about preparing. My God, did we prepare for this for this winter? We spent months and months and months preparing for this. So you talk about planning. We have planned.
This is not the statement that I had expected. Today, it's not the statement I think that the people of Wales needed to hear. This isn't a plan. This is a status report. A report on what government has been doing to try to get the NHS ready for winter, to try to deal with current pressures. But frankly, we know that what this Labour government has done hasn't worked. What we want to know is what they're going to do differently.
Now, away from the issue of the NHS, the issue of gender self-identification also came up this week. Cemlyn, what was said?
Yes, this was also during First Minister's questions, and it's after the Scottish Parliament backed a controversial law to make it easier for people in Scotland to change their gender. So the new rules in Scotland will lower the age at which people can apply for a gender recognition certificate to 16 and remove the need for a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And so during FMQs on Tuesday, the First Minister was asked, was this something that the Welsh Government would consider doing here in Wales as well?
There are obvious and justified concerns following the Scottish legislation being rushed through and due to the nature of the United Kingdom, how it will impact women here in Wales, particularly in regards to 16 and 17-year-olds and sex offenders now being allowed to self-ID without medical diagnosis and the clear and obvious risks that come with that. What conversations have you had with the Scottish and UK government on how this legislation will affect us, and will you therefore rule out such legislation in Wales?
We will do as I've said. We will seek the powers. If we obtain those powers, we will put them to work here in Wales, and we will put proposals in front of this Welsh Parliament so that those people seeking gender recognition are able to do so in a way that is not stigmatised and does not involve them having to go through a lengthy medicalised route in order to establish themselves in the way they themselves would wish to see established.
Mark Drakeford there, making the point that the Welsh Government doesn't currently have the powers to do what's been done in Scotland, but also saying that he would like to introduce similar changes here in the future.
Thank you, Cemlyn. Cemlyn Davis there at the Senedd. Sean, there have been reports that the Home Secretary is planning to scrap a number of key reforms agreed in light of the Windrush scandal. What's going on?
Yes, so the Windrush generation are people who arrived in the UK from 1948 until 1971 from Caribbean countries. You may remember a few years ago there was a huge scandal when it turned out that some of them had been told wrongly that they were in the UK illegally, and some people lost their jobs and they were denied benefits because the Home Office didn't have paperwork and had wrongly told them they were here illegally. So the government commissioned a report from a senior lawyer, Wendy Williams. She reported back and made a series of recommendations, including the creation of a migrants commissioner and many others, 30 recommendations in all. Last week there was a report suggesting that this Home Secretary was not going to go ahead with all of those recommendations, and so a minister was brought to the Commons to respond to an urgent question.
In September 2021, the former Home Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Witham, restated her aims to put right the wrongs of this sorry affair. Yet today we find that the government is rowing back on some of these commitments, including the refusal to hand additional powers to the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration and the scrapping of the reconciliation and community events. Why is this government so terrified of scrutiny? Their toxic combination of incompetence and indifference is failing the Windrush generation as it is failing the country as a whole. Why have thousands of the Windrush generation still not received any compensation at all? And on this, the 75th anniversary of the landing of the Windrush, is the Windrush generation being betrayed by this government once again?
The honourable member knows that the government does not comment in relation to leaps. But what I can say is that we have matched the scale of Wendy's challenge with the scale of our ambition and delivery. Wendy acknowledges that our ambition to achieve genuine cultural change requires ongoing reflection, and this is what we are doing.
Whitehall sources have been quoted in The Guardian as saying that the Williams review is not set in stone, and it would be a betrayal of that review if those affected, if there is to be no Migrants Commissioner, no reconciliation events and no extra powers for the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration.
The honourable lady shouldn't believe everything she reads in the paper, because there is no end date. There is no end date to Wendy's appointment, and Wendy Williams continues to review, and the government takes her views very seriously indeed. And I don't accept the premise of the delay. These issues are dealt with very sensitively.
Is there a risk that the current problems with the migration backlog have deflected attention from dealing with the Windrush problems more urgently?
It's quite right that we mustn't conflate the separate issues of those of the Windrush generation who are rightly identified as British and have a right to be here. And this is very separate and must not be conflated with the enforcement of policies for individuals who actually have no right to reside in this country.
I wonder if the Minister can just confirm whether the Windrush scheme will remain open and whether additional resources will be used. I don't know what the West Indian community has done to this government to be treated so cruelly, so harshly and so heartlessly.
Yes. Minister.
I don't accept that this government is treating those applying under the scheme cruelly or harshly. To the contrary, this government, whilst it's made mistakes, as have successive governments, is doing all it can. There are various improvements that have raised the minimum payment from £250 to £10,000 an applicant. That is not treating people with disrespect. That is rising to the challenge.
Will the Minister give the House a very clear assurance that the Home Office will appoint a Migrants Commissioner?
Minister.
Thank you for that question. I will have to check and write to you. It isn't my brief, but I'm very much enjoying today and listening to all the members across the House. That's information which will be sent to you shortly.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you to you, Sean. And that's it for Politics UK for this week. I'll be back with Politics Live on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Bye-bye.